For years, marvelous Marvin Hagler was the nightmare of the middleweight division. No music, no entourage, no smile. Just a bald, stone-faced southpaw walking to the ring like it was a job, and violence was the business. The best middleweights in the world avoided him, and when they could not avoid him anymore, they paid for it. Hagler did not get fast-tracked. No hype, no favors. He had to grind through the hardest path in boxing just to get a title shot, and once he got it, he held it for nearly 7 years. But this is not just a story about dominance. It is about frustration, disrespect, and one final fight that changed everything. By the end of this story, you will understand why boxers like Thomas Hearns still talk about him with reverence, why Roberto Durán called him one of the toughest men he ever faced, and why, more than 3 decades after his final fight, the name Marvelous Marvin Hagler still means something sacred in the sport of boxing. But to understand how he became the destroyer, you first need to understand where the destroyer came from. Because nothing about Marvin Hagler's rise was accidental. Every ounce of his toughness, every drop of his bitterness, every pound of his punching power was forged in circumstances that would have broken most men before they ever laced up a pair of gloves. Marvin Nathaniel Hagler was born on May 23, 1954, in Newark, New Jersey. He was the oldest of 6 children. His father abandoned the family when Marvin was still young, walking out on his mother, Ida Mae, and leaving her to raise 6 children on welfare in one of the roughest neighborhoods in one of the roughest cities in America. The Central Ward of Newark in the 1950s and the 1960s was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a place where you learned to fight before you learned to read, a place where survival was never guaranteed, a place that either made you hard or it broke you. Marvin got hard. He was a quiet kid by most accounts, introverted and serious, the kind of boy who watched everything and said very little. But there was something burning behind those eyes even then, something his mother recognized. Ida Mae later said that her eldest son had always wanted to box, and that from the time he was just a boy, he had promised her that one day he would make enough money to buy her a house. It wasn't a childish fantasy, it was a vow. And Marvin Hagler was the kind of person who kept his vows. His first real introduction to boxing came from a social worker he knew only as Mr. Joe, who put gloves on the 10-year-old Marvin and taught him the basics. It wasn't formal training, and it wasn't a path to a career. It was just a kind adult trying to keep a fatherless boy out of trouble. But something clicked. Something about the rhythm of it, the discipline, the idea that inside those 4 ropes, it didn't matter who your daddy was or how much money your family had. All that mattered was what you could do with your fists. The first brush with boxing stayed with him. Marvin dreamed of being Floyd Patterson. He dreamed of being Emil Griffith. He dreamed of being the kind of man whose name people spoke with respect. But then in the summer of 1967, everything changed. The Newark riots of July 1967 were among the deadliest civil disturbances in American history. Over the course of 5 days, 26 people were killed. Hundreds more were injured. Millions of dollars in property were destroyed. When the smoke finally cleared, the tenement building where the Hagler family lived was gone, burned to the ground. Just another casualty of a city tearing itself apart. Ida Mae made a decision that would change the course of her son's life and the course of boxing history. She packed up what little the family had left and moved them north to a small working-class city in Massachusetts called Brockton. Brockton happened to be the hometown of another famous fighter, a heavyweight champion named Rocky Marciano. And though Marvin didn't know it yet, Brockton would become the place where a scared refugee kid from Newark would transform into one of the greatest middleweights who ever lived. But that transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen the way you might expect. It was 1969. Marvin was a 15-year-old, still quiet, still serious, still carrying that weight in his chest that kids who grow up too fast tend to carry. He was at a party in Brockton when a local tough guy named Darnell Wigfall decided to mess with him. Wigfall was a boxer, a real one. He trained at a local gym and he had a reputation around town. For whatever reason, he saw Marvin as an easy target. He took him outside, in front of Marvin's friends, and he beat him up. Then, just to make sure the humiliation was complete, Wigfall stole the jacket right off Marvin's back. Now, for most 15-year-old boys, that would have been a terrible memory, something they tried to forget, something they buried deep and never spoke of again. But Marvin Hagler was not most 15-year-old boys. The very next day, he made a decision. He was going to become a boxer. Not someday, not when he was older, right now, and not just any boxer. He was going to become the kind of boxer who would never, ever be humiliated like that again. He walked into the gym where Darnell Wigfall trained first, a place run by a man named Vinny Vecchione. He stood there for a week, watching the fighters work out. In that entire week, not a single person said a word to him. Not a hello, not a what are you doing here? Nothing. So Marvin left. He walked out of that gym and he walked down the street until he found another one, a smaller place, a working-class place, owned by two brothers named Pat and Goody Petronelli. The Petronellis looked at this skinny, quiet, intense kid from Newark, and they saw something. They did not know exactly what yet, but they saw something worth investing in. They took him on and they started training him. Over the next several years, they would become more than his trainers and his managers. They would become his second family. The brothers he never had, the father figures he desperately needed. For the rest of Marvin Hagler's professional career, from his first amateur fight to his last championship defense, the Petronelli brothers would be in his corner. That kind of loyalty is almost unheard of in the boxing business. But then again, almost nothing about Marvin Hagler fit the standard boxing mold. He lied about his age to get into tournaments. He told people he was born in 1952 instead of 1954, so he could enter competitions meant for 16-year-olds. And in 1973, at the age of just 19, he won the National Amateur Athletic Union Middleweight Championship, beating a United States Marine named Terry Dobbs in the final. 57 amateur wins, a national title, and a professional career beckoning. Most young fighters with that kind of pedigree would have been signed by a major promoter within weeks. They would have been fast-tracked to bigger venues, bigger purses, bigger opportunities. But Marvin Hagler wasn't most young fighters. He was black. He was a southpaw. He was absolutely terrifying inside the ring. And he was loyal to his little hometown team of trainers instead of signing with the power brokers who controlled the sport. In boxing, that combination of attributes is a curse. Marvin Hagler was about to learn exactly how heavy that curse could get. Joe Frazier, the former heavyweight champion of the world, said it to his face. "Marvin, you have 3 strikes against you. You're black, you're a southpaw, and you're good. Nobody wants to fight you. Nobody's going to give you a chance. You're going to have to take everything you get in this sport, and you're going to have to take it the hard way." Frazier wasn't lying. For years, Marvin Hagler was the most avoided fighter in the middleweight division. He won his first 26 professional bouts, 19 of them by knockout. He was destroying everyone they put in front of him, and still nobody wanted any part of him. Title shots went to other fighters. Television appearances went to other fighters. The glamour, the money, the attention, all of it went to other fighters. Hagler got the scraps. He got the fights that nobody else wanted. And even those fights, he usually had to travel to his opponent's hometown to get. He fought in Philadelphia against Philadelphia fighters in front of Philadelphia crowds, with Philadelphia judges scoring the fight. And in 1976, that city bit him hard. He lost back-to-back decisions to Bobby Watts and Willie Monroe. Both fights were controversial. Both fights were hometown decisions that could have easily gone the other way. But the losses went on his record, and they nearly broke him. A lot of fighters would have quit at that point, would have looked at the system, looked at how stacked it was against them, and decided it wasn't worth the effort. But Marvin Hagler didn't quit. He did the exact opposite. He got angrier, he got meaner, he got more determined than ever. When he got a chance to fight Willie Monroe again, he knocked him out in the 12th round. When they met a third time, Hagler finished him in 2. That was Marvin Hagler's way of settling disputes. Not with words, not with complaints to the Boxing Commission, with his fists, and with absolute finality. For the next decade, Marvin Hagler would not lose another fight, but he still could not get a title shot. The middleweight championship was being passed around between fighters who were frankly nowhere near his level. And every single one of them refused to face him. It took a promoter named Bob Arum finally deciding to back him. It took years of dominating every contender willing to share a ring with him. And it took Marvin Hagler essentially forcing the boxing world to acknowledge that he could not be ignored anymore. On November 30th, 1979, he finally got his chance. Vito Antuofermo was the middleweight champion of the world, and after 6.5 years of waiting, Marvin Hagler finally got his shot at the title. The fight went 15 rounds, 15 brutal, exhausting, bloody rounds, and when the final bell rang, anyone watching knew that Marvin Hagler had done enough to win. He had outworked Antuofermo, he had outlanded him, he had been the aggressor, he had been the better fighter. But when the scorecards were read, the fight was declared a draw. A split draw, and Vito Antuofermo walked out of that ring still the champion of the world. Marvin Hagler walked out of that ring with tears streaming down his face. Not because he was sad, but because he was cheated and furious. He had waited his entire career for that moment. He had dedicated his whole life to earning that title. And the system had cheated him out of it. Again. It was the same old story. Marvin Hagler was too black, too southpaw, too good for his own good. But he kept going, because what else could he do? He knocked out his next 3 opponents. He refused to be denied. And finally, in 1980, Vito Antuofermo lost the title to an Englishman named Alan Minter. Minter, perhaps foolishly, agreed to defend it against Hagler in London in front of a hostile British crowd at Wembley Arena on September 27, 1980. Minter made the mistake of telling the press that there was no way a black man was going to take his title. It was a stupid, ugly thing to say. And Marvin Hagler, who had spent his entire life being told exactly who he could and could not be because of the color of his skin, made Alan Minter pay for those words. In 3 rounds of pure, focused, methodical destruction. Minter was cut so badly that the fight had to be stopped. His face was a mess. His dream of keeping his title was over. And Marvin Hagler, at long last, was the middleweight champion of the world. But what should have been the greatest night of his life turned into a nightmare. The British crowd, drunk and angry and racist, began throwing bottles into the ring. Beer bottles, liquor bottles, anything they could get their hands on. Hagler had to be rushed out of the ring by his team with a blanket over his head to protect him from the barrage. He never even got to hear the official announcement that he was champion. He never got the belt raised over his head in the ring. He did not get the moment he had worked for 11 years. They stole that from him too. When he got back to Brockton, 10,000 people gathered in City Hall Square to celebrate. The skinny kid from Newark, who had arrived in their city as a scared teenage refugee, was coming home a world champion. It was the welcome he deserved, the recognition he had earned. And for the first time in his life, Marvin Hagler allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was finally starting to see him for what he really was. 2 years later, he legally changed his name, because even as middleweight champion of the world, television announcers kept refusing to call him Marvelous. They would introduce other fighters by their nicknames: the Hitman, Sugar Ray, Manos de Piedra. But when it came to Marvin Hagler, they just called him Marvin. No Marvelous, no flair, no respect. And Marvin had finally had enough. So in 1982, he went to court and he legally changed his name. From that day forward, his birth certificate, his driver's license, his passport, every official document he possessed, bore the name Marvelous Marvin Hagler. If they would not give him the respect voluntarily, he would make it legally impossible for them to deny him. And so began the reign. From 1980 to 1987, Marvelous Marvin Hagler ruled the middleweight division with a ferocity that the sport had rarely seen. 12 successful title defenses, 11 of them by knockout. A reign of 6 years and 7 months that stands as the second longest undisputed middleweight championship reign of the 20th century. A knockout percentage of 78%, the highest of any undisputed middleweight champion in history. He was not just beating his opponents, he was dismantling them, breaking them down physically and mentally, making them question why they had ever agreed to step into a ring with him in the first place. He beat Fulgencio Obelmejias twice. He beat Mustafa Hamsho in 11 brutal rounds. He beat William Caveman Lee in a single round. He beat the British challenger Tony Sibson in 6. Every time a new contender rose up through the division and earned a shot at the champion, Marvelous Marvin Hagler took that shot and turned it into another knockout on his highlight reel. But the truly legendary fights, the ones that would define his legacy for all time, were still ahead of him. In November 1983, Hagler agreed to defend his title against Roberto Durán. Manos de Piedra, the Hands of Stone, a 3-division world champion, one of the greatest fighters of his generation, and a man who, despite being smaller than Hagler and past his absolute peak, proved to be one of the toughest challenges of Marvin's career. For the first time in his championship reign, Hagler could not put his opponent away. Durán went the full 15 rounds. Even more shockingly, Durán was ahead on 2 of the 3 judges' scorecards going into the 14th round. It took a massive rally from Hagler in the final 2 rounds to pull out a unanimous decision victory and retain his title. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that even the best fighters in the world could be made to look mortal on the wrong night. Marvin took that lesson to heart, and he never forgot it. Because his next fight was going to require him to be more than mortal. His next fight was going to require him to be legendary. Thomas Hearns, the Hitman, the Motor City Cobra. A 6'1" freak of nature with a right hand that had crushed every single opponent he had ever faced. A welterweight and light middleweight champion coming up to 160 pounds specifically to take Marvin Hagler's title, and absolutely convinced that he was going to do it in spectacular fashion. The build-up to the fight was unlike anything boxing had ever seen. Bob Arum sent both fighters on a 23-city press tour across the United States and Europe. By the time they arrived in Las Vegas for the fight on April 15, 1985, the 2 men genuinely hated each other. The contempt was real, the anger was real, the violence they were about to unleash on each other in that outdoor ring at Caesar's Palace was going to be very, very real. Hagler wore a baseball cap to the press events with a single word on it: war. That was his promise. That was his warning. He was not coming to dance. He was not coming to box. He was not coming to survive. He was coming to war. And when the opening bell rang on that warm Las Vegas night, Marvelous Marvin Hagler kept his promise. What happened in that first round is still considered by many experts, fighters, and historians to be the single greatest round in the entire history of boxing. 3 minutes of uninterrupted, all-out, murderous violence. Neither man took a backward step. Neither man tried to circle or clinch or recover. They stood in the center of the ring, and they threw leather with everything they had. Hearns hurt Hagler with a right hand. Hagler hurt Hearns right back. They traded blows that would have knocked out lesser men 10 times over. By the time the bell rang to end the round, both men were bleeding, both men were exhausted, and the entire boxing world was collectively holding its breath. Hagler was cut badly on his forehead. The blood was pouring down into his eyes. The ringside doctor came over to check on him between rounds, and Hagler famously snapped back, "I ain't missing no nothing," meaning I do not need to see to finish this fight. I just need to feel him, and I can feel him. In the second round, Hagler broke Hearns' right hand. The weapon that had carried the hitman to glory was suddenly useless, and Hearns, bleeding and wounded and fighting a one-armed war, started to fade. In the third round, marvelous Marvin Hagler ended it. A right hand to the temple sent Hearns staggering across the ring. A follow-up flurry put him down. He tried to get up. He tried to beat the count. He tried with every ounce of heart and pride that made him a champion. But his legs would not cooperate. The referee waved it off. And just like that, in 8 minutes and 1 second of the most violent boxing ever witnessed, marvelous Marvin Hagler had cemented his legacy as one of the greatest fighters to ever live. After the fight, Thomas Hearns was gracious in defeat. He said that Hagler had fought his heart out and that the two of them had put on a great show for all time. He was right. Hagler and Hearns had given boxing fans a gift that night, a moment that would be replayed and revered and remembered for as long as people loved the sport. One more title defense followed. In March of 1986, Hagler took on the dangerous Ugandan puncher John the Beast Mugabi. Mugabi came into that fight with 26 professional wins and 26 knockouts, a perfect record of absolute destruction. For the first several rounds, he made Hagler work harder than maybe anyone ever had. It was a grueling, exhausting, punishing fight. But in the 11th round, Hagler found the opening he needed, and he ended Mugabi's night and his undefeated streak in the same moment. And then came the fight that would break Marvin Hagler's heart, the fight that would drive him out of boxing forever. Sugar Ray Leonard had been retired for 3 years. He had suffered a detached retina. He had not fought in a meaningful bout since 1984. By any rational measure, he had no business being in the ring with the undisputed, undefeated, terrifying middleweight champion of the world. But Sugar Ray Leonard was not just a great fighter. He was a master strategist, a brilliant self-promoter, and one of the smartest boxing minds of his generation. He had been watching Marvin Hagler, studying him, looking for weaknesses, and he believed he had found them. Leonard convinced Hagler to agree to some unusual concessions for the fight. 12 rounds instead of 15. Larger gloves. A bigger ring. Every one of those concessions favored a faster, lighter, older fighter, trying to stay away from a powerful, relentless champion. Hagler agreed to all of them because he was the champion, because he was confident, because he wanted the fight, because he wanted the money, and because he wanted to prove that nothing Sugar Ray Leonard could do would make any difference once they were in that ring together. On April 6, 1987, at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, marvelous Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard finally met. And for 12 rounds, Leonard did exactly what he had planned to do. He danced, he moved. He threw flashy flurries at the end of each round to impress the judges. He avoided real exchanges whenever possible. He ran, he survived, he put on a show. Hagler, for his part, landed the harder, cleaner punches throughout most of the fight. He stalked Leonard relentlessly. He hurt him in several rounds. By most objective measurements, he did more real damage than his opponent. But when the scorecards were read, the judges saw it differently. One judge scored it for Hagler, one judge scored it for Leonard, and the third judge, Jojo Guerra, scored it a ridiculous 118 to 110 for Leonard, giving him 10 of the 12 rounds. A split decision victory for Sugar Ray Leonard. And just like that, marvelous Marvin Hagler's reign as middleweight champion of the world was over. Hagler was devastated. Not because he had lost the fight. He genuinely believed he hadn't lost the fight. He believed with every fiber of his being that the judges had robbed him of his title and given it to a man who didn't deserve it. The rage, the heartbreak, the sense of betrayal that he felt that night would never fully leave him. He refused to give Sugar Ray Leonard a rematch. When Bob Arum approached him about it, Hagler glared at his promoter and said, "Tell Ray to get a life." And that was the end of the discussion. Marvin Hagler walked away from boxing at 32 years old with 62 wins, 3 losses, 2 draws, and 52 knockouts. He never fought again. Not for a comeback, not for money, not for revenge. He was done, but unlike a lot of former champions who spend their retirement years chasing what they used to be, Marvin Hagler found something else. He moved to Italy. Of all places, he fell in love with the country and the culture and the food and the pace of life. He learned Italian. He started a new career as an action movie star, making Italian action films with titles like Indio and Virtual Weapon. He provided boxing commentary for British television. He became a respected elder statesman of the sport, showing up occasionally at major fights to receive the thunderous ovations he always deserved but never quite got during his active career. He got married to a wonderful woman named Kay and settled down. He raised his children. He stayed out of the spotlight. He never complained publicly about Leonard or the decision or the career that could have been. He just lived his life, on his own terms, with his own dignity. Because that is who marvelous Marvin Hagler was. A man who had spent his whole life earning everything he ever got, and who in retirement was finally free to simply be. In 1992, he was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame. In 1993, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. The Ring magazine named him Fighter of the Year twice. Boxing Illustrated named him Fighter of the Decade for the 1980s. Every honor the sport could give him, it eventually gave him, and every one of those honors was deserved. On March 13th, 2021, the boxing world was shocked by the news that marvelous Marvin Hagler had died unexpectedly at his home in New Hampshire. He was 66 years old. His wife Kay announced his passing on his fan page. Tributes poured in from every corner of the sport. Thomas Hearns spoke of him with love and respect. Sugar Ray Leonard expressed his sadness. Bob Arum called him one of the greatest middleweights ever and one of the greatest people he had ever known in the business. A real man, loyal and fantastic. In June of 2024, the city of Brockton unveiled a bronze statue in his honor. It stands in a park that also bears his name, Marvelous Marvin Hagler Park, in the city that had adopted him as a scared refugee kid and watched him grow into one of the greatest fighters who ever lived. Brockton, the city of champions, home to Rocky Marciano and marvelous Marvin Hagler, two men who proved that greatness does not need to come from greatness, that sometimes the hardest lives produce the hardest fighters, and that sometimes, if you are lucky and tough and relentless enough, you can turn every single disadvantage into a weapon. Marvin Hagler's career was defined by his bitterness as much as by his brilliance. He fought with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. He never forgot how long it had taken him to get his title shot. He never forgave the judges who he believed had robbed him against Leonard. He never softened his edges to make himself more marketable or more likable. He was who he was. Take it or leave it, and most people eventually chose to take it because there was something undeniably real about him. Something that a more polished, more media-friendly fighter could never have offered. He was authentic, he was earned, he was marvelous. Not because a promoter gave him that nickname, but because he forced the entire world to call him that. The boxing style he brought to the ring was different from anything that came before or after him. He was a switch hitter, technically a southpaw, but able to fight just as effectively from the orthodox stance. He had a chin made of granite. In his entire professional career, spanning 67 fights, he was knocked down only once. His durability was legendary. His work rate was relentless. His punching power was devastating from either hand. And behind all of it was a will that simply could not be broken. Marvin Hagler did not know how to quit. The word did not exist in his vocabulary. And his opponents knew it, and that knowledge broke them before his fists ever did. They do not make fighters like Marvin Hagler anymore. The boxing landscape has changed too much. The money comes too easily now for the top prospects. The path to a title is smoother, faster, more commercial. Fighters do not have to spend 7 years being avoided before they get their first shot. They do not have to travel to their opponents' hometowns. They do not have to legally change their names to get respect. And whatever gains the sport has made in terms of fairness and accessibility, something has also been lost. Some essential quality of desperation. Some edge that only comes from knowing that every single fight might be your last chance. Marvin Hagler had that edge. He carried it with him into every single training session, every single sparring match, every single championship defense. And when he finally walked away from the sport, he took that edge with him, and he buried it somewhere only he knew. He never tried to come back. He never tried to recapture what he had. He never chased the ghost of his former self like so many great fighters do. He made his statement. He made his legacy. And then he walked away with his dignity intact. He was the kid from Newark who watched his home burn in a race riot. He was the teenager who walked into a Brockton gym after being humiliated by a street bully. He was the contender who was told he had 3 strikes against him before he even stepped into a professional ring. He was the champion who had to legally change his own name just to be called by his proper title. He was the warrior who fought Thomas Hearns in the greatest round in boxing history. He was the retiree who moved to Italy and found peace. He was the husband and father who lived quietly until the day he died. That was marvelous Marvin Hagler, one of the greatest middleweights who ever lived, one of the most feared fighters of his generation, one of the most authentic champions the sport has ever known. A man who earned every single thing he ever had, the hard way, against all the odds, with nothing but his fists and his will and his refusal to be denied. They called him marvelous, and by the end, every single person who ever watched him fight understood exactly why. Like and subscribe for more boxing legends and their untold stories. Until next time.